Dr. Loudon pointed out that when we think of historic preservation, it's a much larger enterprise than just trying to repair an old building. It cuts across our culture. Aldo Rossi in the mid-60s made a distinction between monuments that were active living monuments and monuments that were dead. There's an interesting distinction because that was the point at which architecture theory was beginning to turn a little corner. Now in Borderlands, there's another distinction, and that is all of the allusions, the historical allusions built into the graphic context of that game are basically relics, which adds to kind of another dimension. When we think about historic preservation, it adds to kind of another dimension about how our culture begins to accommodate, appreciate, and appropriate its history. So what I'm interested in now, actually, if you think about where we are in terms of how we think about Borderlands as a part of our culture, think about how we begin to represent our own history, then I'd like to make one other observation in apposition to that, and that is that if you think about it, the importance of historic structures move across time, at least in the United States, with a kind of a 50-year arbitrary curtain. In other words, as we move across the second half, we move that curtain across the second half of the 20th century, we begin to uncover new buildings that become historically significant. As we look at our interest of sustainability and the importance of sustainability in the world, what buildings are most sustainable? It's the ones we save. Okay. How do we save them? As we move across the second half of the 20th century, two things emerge, two thoughts. One is that really up until World War II, the United States was actually never part of the larger architectural hegemony, the Western hegemony of architecture. It was really kind of an afterthought. We were regionalist. Look at Gill, Neutra, and Barnard Maybeck. Look at Frank Lloyd Wright, basically regionalist. Now, as we cross into the second half of the 20th century, which is where we are with that 50-year curtain, the United States emerges as essentially a part of the architectural hegemony. Now that's interesting because some of those buildings were built in Texas. Some of the most important buildings in the world were built in Texas. Now this may seem like it's a long distance from my task, which is just to introduce Mark Gunderson. But I introduce it with the idea that, in my opinion, Mark is probably the most knowledgeable person that I know for that period of architecture. He knows more about how modern architecture moved into the second half of the 20th century and how it affected Texas architecture than anybody alive. So that's my introduction to Mark. But I am bound by Dr. Loudon's very well worked out script to also read his biography, should you want to know about his other accomplishments. Mark is a distinguished alumni of this college. He established his firm, Mark W. Gunderson Architect, a practicing architect in the Fort Worth area with a distinguished career of service to the profession. Mark has been board vice president and chair of panels and symposia for the Dallas Architecture Forum. Mark is a past president of the AIA Fort Worth. He's a past president of the Dallas Architecture Foundation and makes regular contributions to Texas Architect, our TSA's professional magazine, Site, a magazine by the Rice Design Alliance, and Competitions. He is one of 7 co-authors of the 1,000-page double-volume Buildings of Texas to be published at a future date by the Society of Architectural Historians as part of the series buildings of the United States. Please join me in welcoming Mark Gunderson. Mark, thank you.
Andy, I don't know what to say, thank you. Between that introduction and Rima's presentation, I'm sort of speechless here, so if it takes a moment to catch my breath, and I also have a bad habit of working from notes, so I apologize if I look down, but I'll lose my place if I don't. Thank you, Elizabeth, for this opportunity to talk. I'll do my best. It's early morning, I'm a quiet person. If you know me, you know I sort of have one foot in Fort Worth and one foot in Dallas, as Dean Renoy pointed out. I sort of have one foot in architecture and one foot in art. I have a foot in academia and a foot in practice. I love art and science equally, and so it just irritates the hell out of everybody. And, but it tells me I'm sort of standing where I want to be. And my hope today is to try to bracket all these things. I'm feeling better about it from dinner last night and from the presentations so far. How fragile and how obdurate our existence is at the same time. Distance and time as a kind of distance gives perspective. Perspective aids our objectivity, and objectivity allows the kind of sensitive discrimination that's critical to our reasoning and to our intuition, which allow for the kind of judgment calls that are required in preserving or saving anything, much less buildings, as artifacts. As humans, we like the first of things and we like the last of things. The middle ground seems to always fall out, and I want to try maybe more in the philosophical realm for a bit here before we even come to the idea of a building to talk about those things. There's a saying, which I think is American Indian, that the things that last longest in time lie closest to the truth. And I think there's a reciprocity to that. In fact, that humans, by cultural determination of significance over civilizations, over enormous amounts of time, in effect, we select part of what endures over time by things we care about. The rest, and in fact the majority, is chance, coincidence, circumstance. As much as we don't like to think about it, it's sort of beyond our control what things might last 2,000 years. And we can talk about that in a little bit later. I think of architecture as poetechnical work, meaning that it's a reconciliation of these kinds of dualisms that we create when we try to oversimplify things. We're going to talk a lot about this, I think. It's a kind of a ubiquitous form of presumption, which I think is a kind of arrogance on the part of the human race. At the latest estimate, you know, from the Hubble Deep Space shot here, the latest estimates could be that we have as many as 250 billion galaxies in the universe, and every galaxy could have as many as 250 billion stars. And so it's perplexing to me. Still, we think this is about us in some way. As though the night sky was some decoration for our existence. And we try, we know that, we try to map this out. We know that there's sort of pre-existing dualisms. We know in our existence on Earth we have the sun and the moon, day and night, and so on, that are central to our need for structure. But note that in saying that, I just took out what actually is the rest of the cycle of dawn and dusk and so on, and just set up an opposition for that. We have this habit, which we'll talk about. So forgive my diagrams. My handwriting's bad. It looks like I've had a stroke or something, and I'm not much on presentation. I love beautiful drawings, but I also just care about the idea and try to get it on a sheet. So we set up, in addition to the sort of pre-existing dualisms, we set up man-made dualisms in order to come to grips, to locate ourselves within this existence. And so we set up oppositions and then place yourself within this linear opposition. And this is really the root of Western logic, and we could say Eastern logic is kind of the complete opposite of this. You take poetry, for example, and pragmatism, and grab the ends of the string and pull them around into a circle. And I think, in fact, if you go far enough into pragmatism, you get a kind of pragmatism that becomes poetry, and vice versa. I find the Eastern version of this much nicer, but this is how Western logic works. And so for a moment I want to talk about that. We literally have to make sense. We have to literally construct some way to exist in the world we set up these oppositions up and down, in and out, front, back, top, bottom, here and there, so on. This difference, this distinction and discrimination are the conceptual tools, in effect, kind of the simplest two-part pattern for understanding where we are. And inevitably, as human beings, we innately leave out half of everything just because we're lazy or we're looking for a shortcut or whatever. And in fact, I think that's part of the issue here. For example, we tend to never think of the roots of the tree, which are equal and opposite in terms of bring in nutrition and so on. For over 1 million years of our prehistoric existence, and really even before there was such an entity that we even call man in the order of things, what preceded us had this one tool, a stone hand axe, which if you were talking to neuroscientists, they would tell you that the idea and the tool have this reciprocity. The idea causes certain tools, tools cause certain ideas, and it's not one or the other. It's not that you have an idea about making a tool and so on. They inform each other. So I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that if this is our one tool for at least 1 million years before we're even anything vaguely like a human being, that our brain has developed in a way that cuts things in half. And so that Western opposition I was talking about, that bifurcation of our existence into two things, setting up everything as an either-or logic, comes from these tools. It's a kind of hardware-software relationship. And so the either-or logic is so, it permeates everything that we do in our existence. And the current version of binary logic in computers is exactly that same thing, on or off, black or white. And it can get to pretty sophisticated. It can get to Riemann's work and to fractals and so on, to try to work out the gray areas and things that aren't. In fact, life isn't black and white, as you know. So it manifests itself, though, in other more insidious kinds of ways in intrinsic situations in life. Sports competitions, bicameral governments. We're in the middle of one right now where our presidential selection set up like a football game, and you have a winner, you have a loser. We oversimplify everything, and in fact, you could argue that the whole discussion about the middle class in America falling out is because we've basically tried to oversimplify our entire existence in America, and it is falling out. The middle ground, as we'll talk about in architecture in a minute, is falling out as well as an idea. So over time, we make distinction by scribing a line. The word, and I have heavy emphasis on language as the repository for all these things, so forgive me if I take things apart all the time, but a line describes. The description is to draw a line through something or around something or whatever. The word script is the past tense of all that. Another word that's rooted in this is rive, R-I-V-E, which is pretty archaic, but drive, river, rivals. You could find infinite versions of that. They're about splitting ideas into two things. Oscar Wilde, I always love the quote that art, like morality, consists in drawing the line somewhere. We have to do that somehow to delineate an idea from some other thing. Measurement of any sort is a form of description, whether it's mathematical or not. That's how we describe things. The line on the ground was an act by a human being over time. This, I'm just using Texas examples for as many things as I can. Of course, this is Robert Smithson's last work. He died taking photographs of this project on Stanley Marsh's ranch, Marsh's ranch north of Amarillo, the spiral Amarillo ramp. And visible from space, although it's actually not a very large work in dirt, but this act is, of course, archaic, and we'll have a lot of examples as we go along the way. So, if your one tool for over 1 million years splits things in half, it shouldn't be an accident that sectioning of things is how we come to understand the interior of an idea in some way. And whether it's autopsy and medical issues, CAT scans, whether it's in architecture and you're slicing architectural sections, that act of splaying something, the word display, to cut something into two pieces to look into it, is our fundamental conceptual tool. And if you were to track in language, the CAT words, category, catalog, catharsis, catastrophe, locate. Anytime you see CAT in a word, you can pretty well be sure that it grows out of that idea of cutting into things to take a look at it. In architecture, of course, that's the whole meaning of to slice something open to reveal a detail is the fundamental form of description that we use without even thinking about it. A plan was originally a plan from plane, from a flat surface. It was a plan section was originally what that was called before it was a plan. And it shouldn't be an accident that those kinds of drawings are much like anatomical drawings and so on, trying to understand that. They grew at the same time. The original St. Peter's, sliced in section. Okay, so then having cut things apart, in order to make sense, we place things, literally place things into something like conceptual drawers, for example. We sort, S-O-R-T, we sort things, we're sorting. And it is, we would have no existence if our brains couldn't do this. We didn't have some way to describe how we exist and where we are. The art history version of this has become kind of the architectural history version of this, of putting things into styles and so on. And I think as long as you understand that you're doing that, and that, you know, it's a peeve of mine, kind of funny. If you were if you were de Kooning and somebody was shoving you in a drawer of abstract expressionists, he would tell you he had nothing to do with the other guys that were in the drawer and so on. And it's kind of like using black and white tools again to describe things that are gray. But nonetheless, we have to have some form of structure to have the conversation at all. So that's how those things start. Another West Texas example. MoMA's chart on art history. There's dozens and dozens of really interesting takes on trying to describe the history of the world, part one. Okay, so if you take two conceptual systems and you overlay them 90 degrees to each other in some way, you make a grid, in effect, a network, and it allows you to locate things in two dimensions. The CAT word again, C-A-T, you can describe where something is by where it is on that grid. And of course we know longitude and latitude on the globe gave us time for ships. Ships were lost at sea if they didn't have time, and until longitude existed, there was no way to even know where they were. More recently in space photography, you can see perfect grids inside the images that are taken because for scalar reasons they can discern that sort of thing. It's an act of weaving. In 3 dimensions, you have, and basically the root of this really comes from the 2-dimensional, but there's a moment where this is created really, where René Descartes, as in Cartesian coordinates, is in his tent in the military on the Danube in November 1619, and he's watching a fly fly around in the upper corner of his tent, and it occurs to him that with 3-dimensional grids laid on top of each other that he could locate exactly where the fly was. So he doesn't write about it for another 20 or 30 years, and then 500 years later we have AutoCAD and Rhino and software that's predicated on all that. But anybody that thinks that the computer in the past 50 years or something generated wireframes, or this is Uccello's chalice from the 1500s, and you know, we're kidding ourselves again at the idea that we've invented something out of the blue that has been laying there for centuries. So the act of crossing in a location is, of course, is ancient in origins in establishing place. The Roman city was laid out this way, the Carta Decumanus, north, south, east, west, and the Pomerium, which was the outside limits of the city, was usually a circle. You know the story of Romulus and Remus, where he killed his brother for questioning how sacred the Pomerium was. So it's about the center of something and about the edges of something, defining the heart of it and the perimeter, which of course is true of art and architecture. We can talk about all this too later in a little way. The word circumstance is rooted in this. The idea of describing a place as the circum as in the circle, and a stance and modifying and defining a place. These kinds of ideograms predate any kind of Roman usage by thousands of years, and they're prior to, obviously, to any kind of Christian religious symbols of a cross, so on, or any kind of, just like many biblical parables are predated by thousands of years by parables from other civilizations more ancient than that. it came to be recognized as the word, in a way, for a city. This is an Assyrian stone carving of that same thing, and so this is how cities were represented for centuries. And maps tended to do the same thing again, where you could show the center of the city and you could show the perimeter. Sometimes that was actually a wall or not. And whether it may be the city wall, it may not actually be round, but. Okay, so then we take perspective for granted, but of course perspective is a man-made construct mentally in all this. This is the Durer etching, and he's just taking the grid in order to show a three-dimensional object on the table as a two-dimensional drawing. If you know me, you know, I think when things go without saying, those are the very things I think in life that should be said, because if you take it for granted, you abuse it in some way. And so I think as an architect, taking perspective for granted is a really slippery slope. I think there's a lot of really wonderful research lately on other forms of visual presentation, not to mention just Western culture. But credit for this, for perspective, usually is given to Brunelleschi on the steps of the Duomo in Florence with a little camera piece that he made to frame the baptistry. All of this is, I think, a really nice conversation about pictorial mechanics and how we represent anything as our existence. This is going to be kind of funny, but basically tablets to pages to paintings to windows to stages to televisions, monitors, and so on. Points of forms that we use. The common theme, in a way, I think, is that, like a theater proscenium, is that we've come to understand that when you frame something, you're saying that it's an exception to the moment that you're in, or you're sort of holding it, it's like a pause button on reality for a moment, and so that within that frame you can do things that you want to do. If you're in a room and if you're looking at this slide right now, you understand that that's somehow that what's going on inside my slide presentation is different than what's going on in the room in some way. So we don't think about these things, but that's how our brain works, and those are the agreements, in a way. They're sort of tacit agreements. If you frame a tree in the middle of the landscape, you've said in a certain way that there's something about that tree at that moment that needs to either be addressed, or you are setting up a mnemonic of exception. So we also, another tool that we use in talking about form is that we deform things to learn the extent of it. When we talk about pushing the edge or pushing the envelope, you have this mental image of something sort of inside a big bubble, and you're pushing the outside up to try to figure out where it is. So you are trying to find the extremities of it, you're trying to find the bounds of it, you're trying to find the outline, quite literally the last edge of the thing. And you know that you've crossed it when you're outside. You know when it becomes something else, that you're into something else. It's abuse, in a way, and so it's an intentional misuse. Art does this all the time. It's sort of the given role of art is to get out and abuse things to figure out when it ceases to be one thing and to become something else. Okay, so having set up these either-ors in Western logic, I would say it's not. It's both. It's art and science. It's poetry and pragmatism. It's theory and practice. I'm just using this as a kind of poetic example of that, but that it's search and research. It's thought and feeling. If you can stop, anytime you see either-or scenarios, if you'll say either and or, and sort of force your brain to go back in and take both of them in, I think it's a healthier version of that. So it will stop you from making the kind of presumptions that you make when you say the idea that somehow science is more precise. Well, if you're talking about emotions, poetry is more precise. I mean, the issue of precision isn't tied to science outright in that way, and it's just something that we think. So in the 1700s, the architectural historian Gottfried Semper set up this distinction, which I'm sure you guys have studied, tectonics and stereotonics. Basically, the tree in the cave as an oversimplification, but and it's followed through history since. Frank Lloyd Wright would always say, out of the ground and into the light. I'm going to show you some examples by Alberto Campobeza and other practitioners right now that are sort of red hot, who are all obsessed with this. And Ken Frampton's written about it at great length in his book on tectonics. Tracing the roots of all that back, here's the sort of cave on the right, tree on the left. the arboreal frame like that. And the roots of it in Ken's mind go back to ceramics and to some extent weaving. And I think that's actually really true, that basically you had these skills long before we had clothing or the idea of making buildings. You could weave in some way, and you could make ceramic pots. And so it's not a big jump to scale that up to the scale of human habitation. And one could make the argument that any of these, the buildings in Bahrain and Dubai and so on that we're looking at are really just highly tessellated using ceramics and so on instead of a clay pot. Hybrid versions of this exact same pairing, that you have a structure that's both like a concrete shear wall core that's a ceramic thing with these tessellated skins that are woven around it. This is the Campo Beza house that I was talking about, but I could pick 10 of his. They're the same way, where the concrete base, the plinth, is the cave portion of it, and the arboreal top. One of his studies proving for a house project, which is sort of making that same point. Ondo has done the same thing. This is Hambroich in Germany, but it was supposed to be actually this was supposed to be what Fort Worth's museum was like, was a concrete bar inside a glass box. He just ran into a client that said, we're not going to have a glass roof in Fort Worth, so his idea kind of changed along the way, morphed along the way. But it's another version of that same idea of the ceramics and the arboreal weaving. This is my sense of what's going on in architecture at the moment. The current state of things is sort of the loss of the middle ground, and of course I'm using either or logic to set this up. I'm saying here's two sides of things that are going on, but between the ephemeral on the left and the obdurate on the right, we have, if you work on a computer and you're playing software all the time, there's the argument that architecture doesn't have to exist at all, that the idea can just be something on a computer, and that it has no actual physical existence whatsoever. The obdurate side of things is the Ondo, con, masonry, poured in place concrete kind of thing, where we're putting it out there for time to resist kind of the blunt force version of things. The irony is, the paradox in the whole thing is that if anything exists in weather, over time, it will cease to exist. Weather, over time, even the pyramids are on their way out, ultimately. And so there's an argument which the Japanese understood perfectly, that the ephemeral actually is timeless because it has no existence in the real world, and so weather can't affect it. And the best example of that is the East Shrine, where side by side every 20 years since the 1100s, the Japanese, knowing full well that wood, their material of choice in Japan, wasn't going to last that long, they rebuild the temple side by side. And here you have the old and the new temple side by side. And there's problems with this over time. The cypress doesn't exist in Japan anymore. They have to go to Korea to get the sacred cypress and bring it back and so on. But it's staggering that this has gone on since the 1100s. There's a point of beauty in this that I think could relate later to a conversation, that what's housed in this shrine, after you get through these levels of precinct into the interior, and finally one priest can go in to do this, are Japanese sacred objects, and there's 3 of them, and it's a bronze mirror and a sword, and I don't remember the third one, but ultimately, when you have the brand new temple side by side and it's ready to be occupied, overnight they take the sacred objects into a third building, a smaller building that's off-site, and then bring them back into the new building so that the objects aren't confused by going from the fake version or the old version into the new version, let's say. And there's an elegance to that I find really outstanding, really remarkable, that your concern for these objects and their confusion by seeing 2 of the same thing has played out over time like that. Oh, and I would also say, let's see, I don't know if I can back up, I won't back up, but it also relates to another ancient precedent for that, is the Greek paradox called the Ship of Theseus that Plutarch had related, and it's come to have other new versions of it. It's about replacement. It's about, and this is hugely important, I think, in preservation, is the idea of trading out materials for new materials. And in the Greek paradox, a ship pulls up into port and gradually one board at a time gets replaced with new material. There's a second version of it where there's 2 ships and they trade materials in one way or another, and so it's a question of identity. At what point does it cease being the ship that it was, made out of the original materials? And if you move all the materials and trade with another ship, which is the ship that has the name Theseus, which isn't. And course, like good paradoxes, there's no good answer to that, but we face it every day. There's an American version of that called Washington's hatchet, where the guy says, yeah, I have George Washington's hatchet, and we've replaced the head over time, and we replaced the handle over time. And so in any case, is it the same thing? Oh, I went backwards again. Well, so what I was going to say in that earlier, let's see if I can go back. Yeah, posture and gesture to me is a kind of a breathing in things, where, let's say posture is about internal concerns and about stance, structure in a way. Gesture is about external relationships and context. And I believe that if you find the balance in that, if you reconcile them with real care, then you can hit what I would call verdure, which is health and grace, and something which I think is hugely missing in most discourse anyway about anything is what I would call proportion of concerns, where you're not lending too much emphasis to one element of an argument and forgetting the entire rest of the argument. So in any case, this is what I would say, this is the life cycle. This is a natural life cycle, forgive my handwriting again, but birth to death, and you have flowering and you have decay. And of course, as human beings, we take out the whole bottom half of it. We don't want to think about it. So we just call it life and death. And we don't address this, what I think is a fundamental issue in our existence, which is decay. And that we invented, lest we forget, we invented the idea of waste. Nature doesn't waste anything. It becomes decay, and it becomes the food for the next birth and along the way. We just don't like thinking about all that. And of course then there's I call this the natural cycle, but it could be interrupted at any point on the top half by accident in some way. You can die in all sorts of ways, or something happens. You may not have what would be called a natural death and all that. Okay, so this is flowering. This is decay. We all know what decay begins to look like in West. This is in Farwell on the New Mexico border. Entropy is that whole, basically, loss of energy in a system. You can smell it, you know the whole thing. You know when something has that, it's the quality that we try to put our finger on when we talk about authenticity, when we talk about things disappearing over time. You can't put new materials in and get that quality. And of course it all happens at a level that's invisible to us, which helps our writing it off and not thinking about it. And I think of those images in India where you have a giant steel ship on the coastline, and Indians, just one little a square foot of steel and an arc welder at a time, are taking the ship apart. But there is this whole level of microscopic work going on in the world that we don't want to know about. West Texas decay, basically. And I love, O'Keeffe said in her work that all that remains is the bones and the blue. And my favorite, this is in Antelope, Texas. And it has an integrity on the way out the door that is something that we'll talk about here in a minute. But this is an example. I think Champ de Scie was a settlement that the French tried north of Houston near Liberty, Texas. It predated La Reunion in 1855 on the west side of Dallas. But it was all wood structures as a fort, and so of course we'd be lucky to find any evidence that it was ever there. It's a really sort of almost tropical kind of hot climate. But it exists as an idea now, just like it existed as an idea in France in terms of the books that were published about it. Those things caused the movement to try to do that again in La Reunion 30 some odd years later. A shot related to demolition, and again the idea of waste, but with respect to buildings. We are accustomed to being able to just blow the thing down and truck it off and make it somebody else's problem. And we have landfills, we have all these issues now to deal with, whether it's this kind of waste or nuclear waste or whatever, the recycling. We have to call it recycling because we don't give a damn about the cycle. If you paid attention to the cycle, we wouldn't have such a thing as recycling. You would have to go back to it. So I had this idea about 10 years ago that what if you had this idea that was like thinking twice, is what I was thinking of. It was that if you had to take buildings apart, if you had to disintegrate buildings, in the same manner of care and time that it took to put them together. If you had to actually take it apart and every piece out of that building had to be reused in not necessarily in its original state, but with the same level of care, then you would put buildings together in really different ways, and you wouldn't have that blasé attitude about let's just throw it out in the world. I think, I don't know if you know the Panther Cave down on the Rio Grande outside Del Rio, but here's this cave on the river there that's been continuously occupied for over 10,000 years. And the midden was in the middle of a cave. When you had bones and so on that were left over, you didn't take them and chunk them across the Rio Grande into Mexico. You put them you folded it back into the middle of your existence. And so I think that those are the kinds of things that we have to start trying to reassess. Whether if it's human remains, this is a burial outside in the far southwest of Fort Worth. We vest things back into the earth or not, but this notion of investment, of vest, all those words again, holding things close. It used to be that we vested important people into important buildings, and we have like Michelangelo and Santa Croce, Leschi in the Santa Maria in Florence. However humble that is, the idea that important people were part of a place and belonged in the important buildings. And granted, these were churches and so on, so the church played a huge role in that. But we don't do that anymore. Buildings don't have that meaning to us to speak of. I love it. This is a few weeks ago, Neil Armstrong's burial at sea. I love it that the first man to stand on the moon decided that he didn't want a headstone somewhere that a bunch of people would always be coming to for the rest of the time, and chose to be cremated and just poured out in the ocean. So that I think, again, sort of the ephemeral and the obdurate version of time. How do you deal with that? Okay, so this is Paul Clay's drawing Angelus Novus of 1920, which not such a big deal, small little canvas, but it came to be owned by Walter Benjamin, who in 1940, then in the months preceding his suicide in Germany, he put together some notes that he called the Theses on the Philosophy of History. It was his last major work, and in that he proposed that history worked, his metaphor was that it was an angel being blown backwards through time and into the future. And basically that this angel was looking on all the detritus, all the crap falling behind him as he was blown into the future. And but it happened by the storm of progress. And so if you like critical theory, that little painting and this idea of the angel being blown backwards became a huge part of critical theory. And I drew this just to kind of describe, not knowing that Kate was going to try to touch on sort of a similar thing here as well, what I would think of as the mechanics of memory and the way that dissipation works. And so you have, here's an event, let's just say this is time and this is place, and you have an event that happens somewhere and it sends out these ripples, which of course, if you were in a flat surface would make a circle or something, but over time they're being blown back sort of like a comet, not unlike Benjamin's. And let's say that how heavy that line is maybe artifacts in some way. The closer it is to the place and to the time and so on, you have this kind of core element of different artifacts that might still survive. And let's call the ripples maybe the kind of the effect that it has on the larger world, which sort of expand as it goes. And so you have, obviously, if you were at that place and time, you have what would be called first-hand experience, and it's etched in your existence in some physical, literal way that you were there. We have a funny now in the past, in fact, there's an argument, that it happened with the JFK assassination in '63. The media now has caused a second version of that in a way where I watched 9/11 happen real time, but it was on television, and so what does that do? I wasn't in New York, I didn't smell the smoke, I didn't see any of that, but I watched the plane hit the tower just like everybody else did in real time. So you're a witness, but you're a slightly different kind of witness than, let's say, first-hand person. And so over time, you get to the second-hand descriptions of those things. Like we're losing right now, we've just lost like the last survivors from the Titanic, or we talked last night, we're losing the guys from World War II, or certainly World War I. I don't know if anybody has survived World War I now, but as those people disappear, the first-hand part of that goes away, and so you're left with the artifacts, and you're left with then second-hand things. And so if you care about reconstructing that, if you care about trying to understand all those things, the best you can do at a certain point over time is start dealing with the little fragments that are left. And then, of course, ultimately, even that falls away, and let's say 1,000 years later, you just have somewhere somebody had written down in a historical journal, they've called something an event. Usually it's a war anymore, and that's about it. And the artifacts will have all begun to disappear, and over time they just disappear. If you're lucky, somebody stumbles on them, or like Schliemann with Troy, if you have an absolute passion for finding something, one person with absolute passion might be able to go back and dig up artifacts or find them by tracing these other fragments in order to try to reproduce something. We'll talk about the Alamo in a funny way in a second, but Stephen Harrigan, that wrote the book Gates of the Alamo, maybe 15 years ago, we had a conversation, and I'm not a historian, I don't think of myself as a historian, but I know that instinct for sort of wishing that you were someplace at a time, and it comes from all these fragments. And Stephen, would give his left arm to be, even for 30 seconds, to be standing on the battlefield at the Alamo, so that he had some idea, so that in his brain he could experience some other time than the one that he's in. And I think that's really what is at the root of this of trying to write things historically, is you just have this huge desire for a split second to know what that moment might have been like. This is obviously Columbia being reassembled, and so the task of history is kind of this same thing of picking up parts blown away over time and trying to reconstruct something that, in this instance we knew what we were trying to reconstruct, but in many instances the further time goes, you don't really know even what it is that you're piecing together. And I would say, in the sense that history begins the second the event. History is a continuum. It doesn't start 25 years from now. It doesn't start 50 years from now. That whole notion of a historical building to me is really alien, as though at some point it's historical. And I think everything is historical. And that when I read the language of the Venice Charter, it seems really clumsy to me that we can't find a better way of saying all that recognizes that our existence is historical. We need to figure out where the line is for those things. This is just to bring up the issue of language, and I think that language, like architecture, is like the same way I've been parsing words through the talk so far, is that language carries those things as a structure, and we rely on it because we'd have no other way to converse. We have no way to convey ideas from one person to another really without it, and it carries all those it carries all those things through time. There is no fixed language, just like there's no fixed set of buildings, there's no fixed anything. It's a changing, shifting thing. And I put this in just to show that language, slang, is a huge part of that. It's just language in the moment. This is the first computer bug. The woman working on a Navy computer pulled a bug out of it because it wasn't working and taped it to a sheet of paper. And now that's part of our language, at least for the time being, computer bugs. And so it can happen in the funniest or whatever, in the strangest of ways. This is just trying to give some kind of a scalar overview to it. We're talking hundreds of thousands of years before we get down to that last few seconds. And I know a lot of people have said it more gracefully, but if you took the sort of geological history of our existence as some kind of upright person and called that a 24-hour day, then basically our whole existence is in that last fifth of a second on New Year's Eve before the clock turns to the next year. So we're kidding ourselves again, like that first slide, when we're saying that this is all about us somehow. And I think that any assessment of our existence that doesn't try to go back to the beginning and at least understand all these things, that clothes didn't show up till maybe 100,000 years ago and so on, we're really missing the point in all that. So we have what would be called artifacts. We have the residue of our existence, and the older it is, obviously, the less context there is for it. It's just really a hint or a kind of glimpse of all that, a flavor, kind of appeal to the senses. Nonetheless, it's there, and it gives you some sort of a taste for all that. I think if you saw Trip to Bountiful, the movie where the woman at the end of her life just wants to get back to her childhood home, and the power of architecture in that, in being able to evoke your childhood and stand in a space that, again, like writing about the Alamo or something like history, it's so powerful that we really can't describe it. And we talk about if these walls had voices and so on. Architecture has that capacity to take you back someplace that I think is a huge part of why we try to save old buildings, is to not let that go. You've seen, obviously, well, I'm talking, you've read, this is 35,000-year-old, maybe sort of the first evidence of any kind of counting or mathematical artifact. This is 32,000 years old from Europe. We basically, if you met this person today, if somehow just, in Star Trek or something, he just showed up standing next to me at the podium, he might as well be from Mars. We have no clue what any of that is about. I mean, really, the language, there is no language probably, there's no, at the same time, I think my wife is fond of telling me that hand gestures and so on, transcend all that. So a smile might still actually mean the same thing to this 32,000-year-old guy. This is a Neolithic house in Katuk, which I'm only showing partly to say it still has the rudiments of a floor plan. I mean, it's still sort of, it's not that far from what we call a house in terms of rooms, in terms of movement through space. When we vest ourselves in a house, in a place, I have this funny fiction about Gable Roofs, which is that, we may love them or hate them style-wise, which I don't care about, but you have to understand sort of where they came from. Imagine that you took a film of a building out on the landscape and you ran this film for a couple thousand years and then try to show it in fast motion, really over the period of a minute maybe. All you would see is weather and things beating down on the top of it. You'd see water falling and hailstorms and so on, just beating this building to a pulp. And to me, that's really the equivalent of, you can say, okay, that's really the same thing as if the building moved and had been shot up in through all that stuff, which is hitting it and which is happening. Anyway, my point is that it's not an accident that a roof form would be a gable chisel shape form over time, even if it happens slower than all that. And so that issue of movement, you can almost, this is going to be a really bad pun, so forgive me, but it's like you can almost call a building a place ship as opposed to a spaceship moving through things. It's sort of, it's fixed, it has fixity, it's in place, but in another way, time is moving against it, and it has all those qualities whether we pay attention to it or not. People say that the role of architecture, as though it's some kind of design rationale, is that a building ought to reflect its time. Well, my feeling is good luck trying not to, because it's 2012 and you can't actually build in the way that people build. We talked about this last night at dinner, that it's a hopeless thing to try to build out of your time. So to me, that's not a rationale for much of anything. And of course, then the other objects, things remain because they're of religious consequence, or this one's governmental consequence, early laws and so on, the roots of democracy in some way, have a pretty good chance. Those kinds of objects were vested in a way of quality materials by people who cared about it. They have a pretty good chance of enduring somehow through time. The Magna Carta, one of the 17 copies of the Magna Carta, it doesn't matter, like Lucan said, what kind of paper that's written on, except in archival terms it did, but the idea is the issue and all that. An Anasazi sandal, which survives only because the cave it was in stayed the same temperature for 10,000 years, or 5,000 years. So the smaller objects, again, have that kind of cultural memory and hand-me-down kind of quality to it. And there is a whole system in life, kind of like the little insect shop that I showed earlier, like rags and bones in the medieval days when they'd come around yelling for that kind of thing, for what's left over from a life. You have flea markets, you have auctions, you have auction houses, you have collectors. If it has any cultural import, it goes to a museum as a secular object, or a shrine in some way if it's a religious thing. All these mechanisms are in place to deal with that. And in fact, the technology of the art world and of the museums are what's really feeding into building preservation now. The same tools, the same sensibilities about things. Art happening quicker and faster, and arguably maybe having more importance in a weird way, it gets there quicker than the architectural side of it over time. There's about 5 or 6 of Shakespeare's signatures. There's Van Gogh's palette. Things, again, that it just takes one little artifact like that to bring back a lot. The very first photograph taken on the moon, Neil Armstrong steps off, and just to prove we're there first, in case he has to go right back up the ladder. And you might note our first move was to throw garbage out the door on the moon from the trip. So again, we have these newer technologies which allow thinner and thinner slices. It doesn't matter really whether it's high technology or low technology, it's all the same thing. Technology, to me, is a vocabulary of processes that are available at a given moment, period. We tend to only talk about technology when we mean high or digital technology lately, but that's not the case. And the quality of an idea in no way is tied to whether it's high or low technology in any way. When we analyze things like this, we're able to look into the existence of an object without doing it any harm, or hopefully no harm, sort of like CAT scans again, not doing physical damage to the body. We have, as you guys know, a long history of screwing up things by thinking that we're repairing it or analyzing it in a harmful way. And so I think, that would be one of the first rules, is first do no harm, and that's a hard thing to do because the tools that you have at any given moment might not be the right tool to do that in the first place. So curiosity kicks in and you abuse it just to find out what it is. It explains like the Chinese tombs right now where nobody's willing to even open the tomb yet because we don't have the technology to deal with what they might find. So you just draw a circle around something and say there'll be a time in future humanity when we can deal with that in some real way. I love the idea of Woodhenge, just that this is, we've had these ideas about Stonehenge now floating around for such a long time, and in the past 5 or 10 years, British researchers have found that basically a mile away or something is, along a river, is the wood version of that, as sort of the duality thing again, of whether it's night and day or whatever, but just that idea is archaic. And so they're now trying to piece that together, the movement between the two, and what might the symbolism be for wood versus stone and so on. I wanted to show 2 cases of what I'd sort of call the extreme preservation in some way. This, most of you will know well, Los I know will know well, the Declaration of Independence, where those documents have such cultural significance to the United States, although you wouldn't know it if you read their history. For the years from 1776 till now, they were thrown in trucks in the rain and moved around. And they weren't taken care of by any sense of the word, but in the 20th century, then they have fairly well been taken care of. And this is the pictures of them being worked on with triple glazed cases now with argon gas in titanium frames that are lowered down at night into 20-foot concrete vaults below that and so on. And it, we don't want to lose the founding sheets of paper from our form of government. And the more that we learn about things, like this was done in 1950 and it turned out not to be great because the paper they set the Declaration down on top of had moisture that had accumulated in the room before they set it in the glass, and so they trapped moisture inside it, and the tiny little bit of moisture that was inside of it was rotting the Declaration inside the frame. So they redid it again a couple of years ago to fix that. There's little sapphire windows in the side of the frame so that they can get in to do testing laterally through it and so on. It's extremely complicated. And then in another sort of stranger version of that, here's Vladimir Lenin, who died January 21st, 1924. And for 88 years, they've waxed him and left him in the tomb in Russia because he was so central to their existence. The structure that he sits in, there is a whole team, I'm certain, of preservationists there who have developed the technology of keeping Vladimir in shape for visitors. And of course, the World Seed Vault that I'm sure you know of in Svalbard, Norway, which is on an inaccessible island there, it opened 4 years ago, and they have about 250,000 seed types from around the world. It's designed hopefully to get in to exist for another 1,000 years in case we do what humans are prone to do and waste ourselves out of existence. There's no single person that has access to this, so one person can't abuse anything that's in there. It's 500 feet back into the mountain. But the idea being that thinking ahead, we might be smart enough to actually save enough seeds from around the world in case we do something stupid. Okay, and then some Texas precedents just for a second. I don't want to beat up the idea of the Alamo, but to say that And this is the only sort of existing photograph shortly after the battle where you see before the Army Corps of Engineers got there and built the pediment over the front door, what it actually looked like. And to say that preservation in Texas, the value of a thing, like I've been trying to say, is an ongoing cultural debate. And even the Alamo in Texas, sort of like our founding document or whatever, it was always up for grabs, and it's certainly up for grabs now. And the two, here's the battlefield, this is the fort as it was, the chapel on the far right bottom. Modern day San Antonio is all over this. The west wall, this west wall is commercial buildings over here, retail full of all kind of bad computer games and stuff. All the emphasis is on this front corner. Losing entirely the sense of the battle up here, and where Travis fell is inside the bank building that's over here. And this building, there's been a long-running argument, if you know the story of the Alamo, the long barracks over here was originally a two-story building, and because of its centrality, that's really the middle of the fort. That's where everybody was, and at the end of it, that's where the most vicious battle was, at the middle of the fort. Not over here, which is a church without a roof, and became a symbol of the battle because it's a church and you're in Catholic San Antonio and so on. Anyway, over time, a grocery store wound up owning the long barracks and built this other building on top of it and so on, and the Army put the pediment on the church and a roof and so on. And all that starts to get really confusing as to what the artifact is and what its relevance is along the way. I never knew until recently that actually the cremated remains of all these guys are in a church further down the street that nobody seems to go to. And you have Adina Desvala on the left and Claire Driscoll on the right, who really represent, I think, both aspects of preservation in a way playing out in Texas. Adina had grown up in Texas as a child and had done any number of oral interviews with people in San Antonio that had been there during the battle and understood that the two-story building was really the important building from the battle, not the chapel and so on, as though you could split that hair. And Claire Driscoll at the time, well, let's say that the grocery store tried to tear down the long barrack building, and Adina found out about it and ran to the Menger Hotel, to the competing hotel, and said, you got to stop this. And they found Claire, who had more money than most Texans. She was 22 years old, and so she used her own money to save the long barracks building. But then the two women fell apart with each other, and Adina, Claire's idea was that the chapel should remain in a big park, and she was actually for tearing down the long barracks building as part of all that. Adina couldn't believe that. In 1908, when a grocery store got its hands on the long barracks building, she locked herself in there and was there for 4 days, refusing to leave or eat, until the governor finally sent somebody and said, come on, the state will buy that and we'll keep it as part of the thing. So I guess I'm saying there's this kind of disparity between somebody who saw it for its historical accuracy and the artifact, regardless of what it looked like, as opposed to the person with the money who liked the chapel, who saw the symbolism in all that as opposed to sort of truth, the sort of profane, sacred side of all that. And 176 years later, there's still an ongoing debate about that entire site and whether the retail should be on the other side of it, whether they should try to carve back out some sense of the fort again in the middle of downtown San Antonio. And so my point isn't which one's right or wrong, it's just that that is what goes on, and that's how we make these decisions over time, and it remains to be seen who steps up to the plate to take which part of it. In Lubbock, you have Buddy's grave here, one of my favorite. I can't come to Lubbock and not go by there, and Stubbs' grave, so. But in terms of cultural significance, let's say it's not trees. Lubbock's never really come to grips with who Buddy was or what that meant to the world, and so you can bring visitors from Germany and have them stand at Buddy Holly's grave, and they can't believe, that you have this basically bad highway department signage and stuff. They'll call their friends in Germany at 2 in the morning to tell them that they're standing at Buddy's grave, and they can't believe it. And you have the Allison House, which has now been moved 10 blocks north from where it used to be, over behind 6th and Cube Pancake House, where Buddy and Jerry came after watching John Wayne and wrote That'll Be the Day back in the bedroom. And the city of Lubbock, when all that development was done here, the hotel and everything along 4th Street, move this house off-site, and they finally brought it back. And so, but it's been here 4 or 5 years now, sitting on that property without a lot of work done. And I've watched over the years, because I could take you on a tour of buddy's old houses here in Lubbock still, and you know, they're not treated well. The new owners, the garage where the crickets rehearsed has been re-bricked and turned into a whole other thing, and there's just sort of no sensitivity at all for that sort of thing. Okay, and so then for the complexity of things, I may end a little bit early here, but here's the world we're in: 340 trillion internet addresses so far, and this is just since the World Wide Web. You know, I mean, I doubt that Timothy Berners-Lee, who most of you guys wouldn't know, the guy that invented World Wide Web, was in London at the opening of the Olympics and was recognized somehow and all that. But anyway, those people are all still alive. And here we are with this staggering complexity of things to deal with. And so we have objects like these now that we're going to talk about somehow for historic preservation. This is, if you're an Apple fanatic, a Mac fanatic, this is the garage where Steve Jobs and the guys put together the idea of a personal computer. Well, you could argue absolutely that needs to be something that's going to survive somehow. And it's going to turn into a big argument about context, and do you keep the whole neighborhood? How do you draw a circle around that and keep it in any kind of meaningful place? And I think of it like Fairmount District in Fort Worth, which is one of the largest historical districts in the country. And you can tell so far I have this habit of extruding things out to the ridiculous just to see where the edge of it is. And so you ask those guys and you say, okay, so Fairmount, do you mean really that in 500 years you want that neighborhood to be exactly like it is in wood with composition and shingles? And I mean, they've never thought that through. I mean, they wrote the ordinance that says it's going to happen that way legally, but as long as it survives them, that's as far as they've actually thought the whole thing through. And so I think there's a lot of missing thought in all this about what is it that we're really setting up. And okay, so over time, another government's going to come along and take that one over, and that'll go away, and the buildings will disappear or whatever, and that's part of that ongoing dialogue. But maybe we think about that now instead of just letting it happen. It's going to happen anyway, but maybe we try to address it in some way. In the Dallas-Fort Worth area, we have another one that's almost the same. This is the house, this was Ruth Payne's house on West 5th Street in Irving, where Lee Harvey Oswald spent the night in the bedroom on the right, and then got his rifle out of the garage on the left and did what he did that morning. And the windows in the living room were just recently enlarged in a way. It has no historical significance, and Irving can't figure out what to do with it, so they haven't done anything with it. But with the 50th anniversary, here we are at the 50-year window again, but next year is the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination, and there will be tourists crawling all over. It's not like, I mean, it's not unlike driving down Elm Street in Dallas, leaving the west side of downtown, and to this day, 49 years later, you're going to see a crowd of several hundred people standing out there professing whatever theory about whatever happened that day. And every time I've driven over here, I wasn't the only car that was on the cul-de-sac just showing it to somebody. And then the technology side of it, this is REMA's projected to a building, you know, but this is a house. And the thing is, all those technical issues, it's basically a monocoque construction in a way where there's, I think the weakness in it that's going to have to be addressed is there's no redundancy in a way. And or I'm using it anyway as an example of things where if you pull out a piece or you use a material that doesn't have the exact same properties in it in some way, it's going to fall apart or it isn't going to work and so on. So we need to address all of that in some way. This is just, after dinner last night, I thought, maybe I spent too much time in West Texas, but this is the put up or shut up part. You know, I just thought, you can arm wave a lot, but what could one architect as a sole practitioner in Texas on a historic, quote unquote, historic building do in some way with new work that might try to pull all this together? And so this is a photography studio that I did about 12 years ago in the west side, in Oak Cliff in the Bishop Arts District, which has turned into kind of a red hot, in fact, this doesn't exist anymore. It was destroyed last year because the property became too expensive and the tenants in it now are more retail. But it was a 1910s commercial shell wood storefront out front. I didn't even bring any pictures of the exterior of it, but he needed to occupy this space. And so the premise was to just take a white drywall shoebox without any detailing to compete, to speak with the tin ceiling that was existing, the old brick walls. The plumber ruined the concrete slab floor for me, or it would have been the original 1910s concrete slab floor. He trenched through it and ruined the whole thing. So I had to put this cement, a sort of composite epoxy cement topping down on top of it. The apertures that were existing in the alley walls on the left were all pulled directly as the apertures into the box, so that if you're in one of those offices, you have a window view really across the hallway around it in the ambulatory kind of space. The detailing is deliberately, we talked last night, some of the architects I care about in a way are well, there's a lot of them, but Giorgio Grassi and Massimo Carmassi in the restoration world, where there's no, for the new work to have any integrity and for the existing work to have any integrity, you should never, they almost, best possible, they should never even touch. And so if you look real carefully, you'll see, oh, you can't even see it in the slide here, son. But there are two pipes. Well, you can barely make out that one. And there's another one over here symmetrically to it. But that's how the services come down. One is taking services, electricity and so on, down into the box so that I didn't have to bring them in from the wall somewhere. And the other one is taking vapor and that kind of thing back out through it, water and electricity. The air conditioning unit was laid, that's the air conditioning unit in a tiny little box in the upper drawing, was sitting on the roof, which was wood roof trusses. You just dropped it down, and then you can sort of see my hand-handed drawing of the ductwork laying on top of the box, so that the registers just drop down into each room as need be, but it's just an aluminum, it's just a galvanized duct laying on top of the box. Again, no pretense, no, but you know, carefully thought through, I should say, you know, things, outlets and so on are all, it's sort of, the best I can do is a sort of perfect object for the function that he had. But basically just cleaning up, this is the backside of it, and cleaning up the areas around it. There were plaster walls that were falling apart, and we just went around with a rubber mallet and knocked off the plaster that was loose, left the plaster that wasn't, wanted to show the brick, so we just painted it. A new A-lamp to do as little intervention as possible to provide artificial light in any way on the thing. Glaze, because that's an alley and for security reasons, the glazing, the wood window frames had all rotted out, so we built new frames and just put simple wire glass in that couldn't allow anybody visibly to see all the computer stuff that goes on back here. And so anyway, I guess in that project, I think if anything, I can sleep at night because I think it has integrity. It didn't try to pretend to be something that was from 1910s. The issue of materials doesn't come to bear, except taking care of the existing materials that were there and then trying to make sure that the new materials met his budget and so on. It was a quiet little thing. This slide is to talk about the kind of poetic aspect of things, that all this conversation about the history of things and about trying to denote what happened in a place and understanding place in another way sort of doesn't matter. It's built in innately into human beings, I think, that if you were walking through the landscape in England and you just came on that, we find a romance about ruins that's beyond whether you know anything about it in any historical way. You just know that another human being was here at some point in time, and it was far enough back that all that's left is like O'Keeffe would say, the bones in the blue. All that's left is this landmark on the ground, and over time you can see how it's accrued. You can trace the development even of that as a footprint through time. The French have that word terroir, which I'm sure I'm butchering, but in the French wine industry, where soil makes its way into the flavor of things, and that you can tell where a wine came from, just sort of that a place is vested in a product over time, and that there's a beauty in that, and that you would take care of a vineyard for centuries trying to maintain that terroir. I was trying to think of a good example. The only text I can think of that comes close to any of this in a way is the new Yale Center for British Art book that Peter Inskip and Stephen G. Wrote recently, a conservation plan for the building. And I had the opportunity of meeting them when they came to the Kimball. We spent a lot of time talking about the Kimball and about Kahn's work. And So they're addressing conservation, preservation, restoration, maintenance, stabilization, consolidation, adaptive reuse, rehabilitation, all those things. And they've sort of taken the Venice Charter one more level through, and they have a really rigorous set of standards that they've applied to that building in a really beautiful way. So if you don't have a copy of it, or I think that's the nicest conservation plan I've seen for a building in a long time. Finally, I was just going to say that in about 1998, right before the turn of the millennium, the New York Times decided that they wanted to put a time capsule out in front of their building. And the idea was that it would last 1,000 years, if not 2,000 years. And they said, in an intelligent kind of way, they said, so how do you do that? I mean, what's the deal with a time capsule? And if you really want it there in 1,000 years and somebody didn't know it, what should we do? And they brought in experts from around the world, archivists, preservationists, and so on, philosophers. And they published the result of all that, which I thought was really interesting. And I think it took 3 copies or something in the magazine to do it. But what came out of it was that if you want something to last 1,000 years, if you're literally going to try to send something into the future 1,000 years and have it be found, good luck, because that's not how things usually last. I mean, most time capsules are just lost. People forget about it, or they're found by complete accident after somebody stumbles on it. They're building a new building and they dig it up or whatever. You can't control any of that. There's almost no good way to guarantee that something's going to last that long. But and then there was the archival conversation about the newer technologies. This stuff, good luck 10 years from now. If you don't have the player, we have videos made on the moon that we don't have the equipment to play anymore, so that we have data we still haven't gone through from moon trips, because NASA can't keep the players updated to convert it to digital or whatever, to keep tracing their own data. And it's a chase. And so the paradox of that is, of course, that paper and pencil have lasted since Egyptian times and earlier, or papyrus anyway. And if you're careful about that, those technologies could last 1,000 or 2,000 years if taken care of in some way. Or like the Anasazi sandal, if it just happens that the context it's in for that period of time doesn't change and it's the right context, then it might survive. But if you have a VHS tape of Lucan speaking, good luck finding a VHS player in 1,000 years. It isn't going to happen. So in any case, what came out of it was that things which endure that long, sort of like the governmental stelae that I was showing earlier, have endured because a group of people found them beautiful. And like a coterie or a cult group always encircled, kind of shrouded this element. The Mona Lisa isn't going to go very far because it's culturally considered significant enough that there's always going to be some group of people in the middle of a war. They put it in a steel case and take it to a different country or whatever. There's going to be somebody, like priests in a way, sort of watching that object. And the only way they determined to inspire that kind of behavior for an artifact was to make it beautiful. And so I think there's something really remarkable about that as an idea that I would think as an architect you'd find really inspiring. So again, I think it's inconceivable to me that an architect would try to practice in a place without any sense of that place. I have friends that think I'm a historian because I care too much about the history of things, but it's not because it's not history outright. It's that I love the place that I work and I'm trying to understand it that way. And the bottom line is that I think over time you try to develop a sensibility about things, and again back to what I'd say, a proportionate concerns, so that that's what I think you buy when you buy an architectural practice. When you hire an architect, is you're hiring a sensibility that's different from some other sensibility. Architectural practices aren't the same, and like an artist, you're looking for somebody whose sensibility is the right sensibility for that project. I put together the architectural search for the Kimball that resulted in Renzo Piano, and I put together a list of 62 firms around the world that we went through with the owners one at a time, and they gagged. I thought it was going to make them better owners by trying to understand different sensibilities, and that one of those guys, some small firm in Switzerland might be the exact right tone for the Kimball, sort of like the Van Cliburn. It might be somebody you've never heard of in a million years, and the right architect didn't, just because you pick up Newsweek and it says this guy's doing all the museums in the world. But anyway, I think that's the most fragile and the most obdurate part of it to me as an architect, as a practice in the real world, is keeping that idea sharp in some way, keeping your sensibility as clear and as rigorous as you can apply it. And it may just be a small photography studio on the west side of Dallas in a 100-year-old building, but you got to start somewhere, and those are the sorts of judgment calls that I think you'll always have to tackle somehow. And you're doing it whether you realize it or not. So I think, as with any profession, it's better to know that you're doing it, and awareness is the bottom line. Thank you very much.